So I want to talk about something today um, that is, I don't think it's widely known, and something that has been based on, I think, also kind of like stereotypes, and not a lot of people know the truth behind this as well. In my experience, and that experience is around the one-child policy. And I'll give you a little bit of backstory on the policy, and then also my experience, because I was one of the adoptees that was brought overseas from international adoption. And so it's a very, very like kind of very harsh and very dark history. And yeah, so trigger warning if anyone's watching this. And yeah, so basically, the one child policy, this is kind of off the top of my head, so I don't know every single fact. But the one child policy started, I think, in the 1970s, like around 1979 till like around 2015, and it was very propagandized for a lot of families to have one child, like mother, father, and a child, and mostly it was families wanted boys just to help with around the household so they could go to work. And like historically, because of the patriarchy and everything, men have been more like wanted, I guess, and it's a very traditional thing. So anyway, so there was a lot of propaganda for a lot of citizens to kind of go towards this policy. A lot of state and laws were imposed to a lot of like different cities, and in these cities, like in the suburbs or in rural cities, they have like like the mayor, or I forgot what they called it, but it's like someone who's like basically in charge of the city. And they enforce these like sub rules as well about propaganda, either like in art forms or like police. They had to police, a lot of police were involved with it, and also they had a lot of nurses and midwives. So this is a very big trigger warning, but a lot of the stuff is very sensitive, especially to deal with a lot of kind of like, I guess, death as well. So yeah, I'm gonna give a little history and then my personal experience as an adoptee. So they had these, like, of course, like policy was set, and a lot of it was very strict. It was a very strict policy, and what ended up happening was a lot of women often got forced sterilization against their will. And if they didn't listen to the forced sterilization, they'd can put these very, very heavy fines on the family that they could not afford. They'd sometimes like destroy houses. They'd rip and tear down houses, and especially like roofs. And these were mostly in like these are in cities and rural areas. And it affected a very large like a lot of women. And yeah, so it was very harsh policy. And when it ended up happening was because, with how things go, there were people that got pregnant more than once, obviously, and what ended up happening, or they didn't want the girl because of like traditional like standards and whatnot. Sometimes family pressure as well. They didn't want a girl as well. Maybe it's not their fault. And what ended up happening was a lot of babies were killed. There was a documentary. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it. All this information comes from that documentary. It's called One Child Nation. It's on Amazon Prime for free. Anyway, and so the nurses and the midwives, if usually, if it was another child that they had, if they already had one, they'd kill the baby. They would unfortunately kill the baby, and they would just dump them like in the streets or in the it was very harsh. They had stories of going to they just leave them in the market, and in the morning the babies wouldn't have survived overnight, and they had like maggots and on them. And they had the story where basically one of her, it was like, I forgot what her name was, but she was making a documentary, and her uncle I think had a second child with his wife, And what ended up happening was it was a girl, and they couldn't have it, so they ended up climbing a couple mountains and leaving her at the market. But she ended up having so many mosquito bites on her face, she passed away, unfortunately. And yeah, it's a very, very sad story. And so there were so many babies that were basically left on the streets and abandoned, me being one of them. And basically it was kind of like an epidemic of that because of how strict the rules were and how, like, you know, forceful and harsh, and they didn't want to hurt their family. And a lot of people were afraid. And, you know, I think also, like, since, you know, like the propaganda, they spread a lot of lies about it as well, being like, oh, like, we have to do this, it's part of, you know, they kept saying policy is policy, we have to listen. A lot of them thought about, like, oh, if we didn't do this, then there would be like cannibalism, people would be like eating people, which is not true. Anyway, so there was two different things happening at the same time with this international adoption. Like, you know, you'd hear it on the news about the one-child policy. And anyway, there was two things going on, and the adoption agencies, the orphanages and stuff, would basically, they would call it trafficking, but it's not, I guess, the sense of it being bad, because it's more or less kind of a good thing that this happened. A lot of, like, low class, like, people that were in poverty felt very, very bad for these babies. And I'm not saying like every person, but in the documentary they talked about how a lot of, like, low income and poverty people, like, did this to kind of, like, because they felt bad and they needed the money. The orphanages would give them, like, money, and they'd basically go around to the different provinces, they'd find as many babies as they could, and they'd take them back to the orphanages, and they'd give them, like, a couple $100s for, like, a baby, and then the baby would, like, internationally, like, you know, do an international adoption or whatnot. And also they'd get money from that. It's around, like, I think it was a lot of money. I mean, it's around, like, I think USD, like $10,000 to $25,000 USD. So they're making a lot of money off of it. The government needed a lot of money at the time, so this international adoption thing, like, really helped build up their economy. Yeah, so they were doing that, and honestly, like, because they felt really bad for the babies, they didn't want them to pass away. So they were giving them to, like, these adoption centers, which I think, you know, it's better than just leaving them on the street to pass away. And, you know, it's very, very harsh. And at least, you know, like, they, you know, some of them gave them an opportunity at a different life. Anyway, and then the other side of it was the government basically going to these, it's not in the city, but mostly, like, rural houses and stuff like that, mostly in, like, poorest parts of China. If they had more than one kid, they'd get these officers to come in and basically take the child without their permission, and they'd steal babies from a lot of rural communities and put hefty fines on these families because they needed, the government needed the money. Sometimes it'd be like $10,000, sometimes it'd be like $20,000, or, like, you know, depending on whatever. And they just steal these babies, and then they give them to the adoption agencies, and then they'd, you know, they'd get internationally adopted, even though they were never originally, like, abandoned. But then, yeah, so that is mostly the story. Anyway, they stopped the one-child policy in 2015, and now they're doing another thing of being like, oh, you should have more than one child, so it's kind of funny. Anyway, so apparently millions of babies have passed away in the process of this one-child policy at the hands of sometimes, like, very young nurses that, you know, like, had to do these things because it was part of their job, and if they didn't, you know, like, their family would get hurt. It's very, very forceful, very sad, and especially with the government taking away these babies and children that didn't want to be taken, you know, the family didn't want to give up in the first place. But then this is where it gets complicated, is because a lot of these adoption agencies of when, like, a lot of these adoption agencies fabricated where the baby was found, because of the trafficking, also the government thing, they wanted to cover that up. And so they just said, like, oh, they were found, like, at this police station or, like, this school, but in reality, There were like random places the babies were found, like maybe in trash, maybe like on the side of the street at the market, and or like the government stole them and they didn't obviously want people to know that. So probably most of the documents about where a lot of these Chinese adoptees were found were not actually, you know, the actual place. And so it'd be very hard for the adoptees to find their original families. And yeah, the documentary also focused on the royal family, and the royal family had their little girl taken from them at a very young age. I think it said she was like 10 months old, and she was adopted overseas internationally. And at the end of the documentary, they found her, which is really nice, and her twin sister. And they didn't reunite in the end, but they were in kind of contact, which was good. But yeah, so that's kind of the whole story about kind of the one-child policy. Yeah, so my experience with it was I was adopted in China at around like 8 months old, and this was around 2003. So this was still when the policy was there. And yeah, it's definitely, yes, I was adopted at 8 months old, and my parents, they're two white people, and they were British, living in Canada. So they brought me back to Canada after a couple weeks in China. We had to stay there for a little bit longer just because I had like a bunch of different infections and diseases. Nothing like super serious, but I was too sick to fly, so they had to bring me to hospitals, and like, anyway, we survived and brought me back to Canada, which is great. Anyway, but yeah, so on my adoption papers, apparently it says I was born in Yunnan, China, and at that, like, someone left me at a school in the middle of the night, which was like maybe true, maybe not true, but I don't know 100% because of either, like, you know, do you think it could have been like the people that bring me in, or like the government? You know, you never know. So that's the thing, like, you just don't know. It's a big mystery and such, like, and so yeah, so we know we were found there. Apparently that's what they said. But yeah, a lot of people are finding them nowadays through ancestry websites, which is really cool. I'm starting to kind of like do that. I have my 23andMe thing, but I'm gonna upload it to a Chinese one, I think. Anyway, yeah, basically they bring me back to Canada, and yeah, my experience kind of growing up in Canada and kind of knowing this like adoption story about myself, it was definitely very interesting because I grew up on an island off the coast of Vancouver, Bowen Island, and it was a very white area, and a lot of white people, white families, yeah, barely any people of color, especially when I was growing up. There was like maybe like 5, and they were mostly adults and they were not kids. And so I experienced a lot of racism within school, a lot of racial slurs and comments, especially like when you're young, you know, like a lot of kids, obviously it's not their fault, but also like it kind of like hurts looking back on it. I don't blame them, but it's just kind of, you know, it's one of those things that you recognize and you're like, oh, that's the kind of like what it'd be like when you live in that area, and not a lot of education to those kids. But yeah, like that was like mostly in elementary school, and then in high school it kind of got a little bit more worse. People would say a little bit more ruder things, and some of the teachers would even say some really strange things as well. A lot of the time, people, the classic thing people always say, and I think every person of color knows this, is, oh, but like, where are you really from? Type of thing. And I like hated explaining that I was adopted all the time. It was definitely, yeah, it was not okay. It was like not okay. Obviously no one really likes answering that. It's like, girl, like, okay. Yeah, so basically I think because of just being around such, you know, white culture, and also like that was the beauty standard, and just kind of wanting to fit in, especially with all like, you know, the kind of racist stuff people were saying. I was like, girl, like, let me just fit in here. So I think I really wanted to integrate myself within that, and what ended up happening was I was like, I don't want to think about anything about like Chinese or Asian culture, anything to do with that. I was like, stayed away from like literally every single thing. And it's kind of sad because I was missing out on a lot. And I've gotten back into a lot of stuff and experiencing more and open. But I think at the time I was just super closed off to anything that was like a reflection of like Asian culture, because I was scared to stand out. Yeah, so that was very unfortunate, and I think I had like definitely like an internalized bias. Not until like maybe not even a couple years ago, maybe 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half, maybe two, I don't know. But one of my friends, she just graduated university, which is amazing. But basically, she asked me this question for her project, and she was like, "What was it like growing up as a person of color within like a very white area?" It was for a sociology project, and I think that like it made me think a lot more about culture and how I felt feeling disconnected within my kind of like ethnicity and culture, and kind of almost, yeah, so it made me think a lot and made me ask questions a bit more, which thank you to her. And obviously, yeah, so now I'm very much more open to exploring kind of my history and ancestry. But yeah, like in that documentary, a lot of the time, a lot of people that they reached out to, that they found the adoptees overseas, and they like matched them with their birth families. A lot of them, they've reached out and they were like, hey, like we found your birth family, would you like to meet them or in contact? And a lot of them said no, they don't want to. And this was like a lot of the American ones in North America. And not really, they didn't really mention Canada, but it was mostly North America. But I also was thinking about that, and I was thinking, I felt like if I was in that headspace like I was a few years ago, I probably would have said the same thing. I would have been like, no, like I don't want to. I want to live my life. But yeah, I think it is, everyone heals differently, and everyone has their own experiences with adoption, and it's very subjective. It's not just like a fixed experience of like, you know, one thing, especially with like this. So it's kind of normal to kind of feel like, you know, like I don't want to know, and that's also okay. And if you do want to know, that's okay too. But also I feel like with this type of thing, with a lot of unknown kind of probabilities, I feel like for me to find like a birth family out there, it's very low chance possibility. I don't really know if I'm ever going to. But you know, the best you can do is try. Yeah, it was a very interesting documentary. I feel like if you're interested in that, you should go watch it. Yeah, but now I'm living in Vancouver Island, and I guess I'm kind of on a journey to find my birth parents. It's not like a high priority just because I'm in school right now. I'm in third year, and gotta lock in, you know. But I mean, it's something that I think I would be open to if I could find them, and if they did reach out, that happens. So yeah, that is my experience with the one child policy, and I know everyone's experience is very different, and yeah, it's it's a very harsh, well, yeah, it's a very harsh policy that many people, like to this day, are very affected by. Yeah, definitely watch the documentary. So it's really interesting. So watch it.